Welcome to this session of interview with Paula Varsavsky. This interview is taking place on the occasion of the 5th edition of the ISLA Festival in the Cervantes in Dublin. I have the pleasure and the honor of meeting today with Paula Varsavsky. You are an Argentinian writer. You live in Buenos Aires. You have published many novels which have been translated into English, one of them being No One Said a Word, which came out in 2000 in English. Another novel which was translated into English was El Resto de su Vida, which became The Rest of Her Life in 2007. Paula Varsavsky also wrote a collection of short stories, El Retrato, which was translated into The Portrait. Several of Paula Varsavsky's stories have been published in magazines, in anthologies, such as Translation, World Literature Today, Hostos Review, and In Your Own Words, A Generation Defining Itself. The latest publication, the latest output is a book which is entitled Las Mil Caras del Autor, which is a book of conversation, and we're going to talk about this later. You are also a contributor as a specialist on English language writers to the Argentine newspapers La Nación, Perfil, La Gaceta, and El Mercurio in Chile. So very welcome, very welcome.
Thank you very much.
So
glad to be here.
Good. Would you like to introduce us to your latest publication, Las Mil Caras del Autor?
Okay. Well, this book is the result of 15 years of interviewing writers, English-speaking writers from the US and Great Britain, mainly. And well, I did this because I knew English. I had lived in the US as a teenager. So when I had to specialize in some literature, when I studied literature, I was advised to specialize in a literature that you know the language. And so many of my classmates at that time at the university specialized in Argentine or Latin American literature, but I chose literature in English, American and British, which was taught at that time in Argentina because I knew the language. So then when I started working, I started writing fiction, and at the same time, almost, I started working as a journalist. So at that time, writers from the US and from Great Britain were not that known in Argentina. That has changed. A lot of them have been translated into Spanish. But say 18 years ago, that was less. And so I offered actually to the newspaper La Nación, which is the biggest newspaper in Argentina, interviews, which I had never done before. But you know, that's what you do when you're a journalist. You offer things you haven't done because it's something you want to do and you want to do research on. So the editor of the cultural section agreed. So I walked out of the newspaper and said, my God, how am I going to do this? So first I started doing interviews over the phone, and then I had the opportunity to travel to England. I was invited to a very interesting seminar that was called the Cambridge Seminar on the Contemporary British Writer. So I met there many British writers like David Lodge, Hanif Kureishi, John Fowles, A.L. Kennedy, and I was able to interview them in person this time, not over the phone. So Malcolm Bradbury also, who died a short time before that interview, unfortunately, such a great writer. So when I went back to Argentina, I was able to sell to the newspapers these interviews to many newspapers in Argentina, in Chile, in Uruguay, and also in Mexico, because there was at the time a big interest, and they had been already translated into Spanish. So, well, that was my start. And then each time I was able to travel. Of course, the newspapers never pay you to travel and do interviews because they don't have budget for that. But every time I traveled for other reasons, say a seminar, or I was invited by a university or several universities. So before that, I started contacting writers and to see whether they would give me some time to interview them. One of the first writers I tried to interview was Joyce Carol Oates. Mm-hmm. And when I tried, I think I called Princeton University, the English department. And I said I wanted to talk to Joyce Carol Oates. I think we were like, what? Almost, are you crazy? She doesn't talk to anyone. She doesn't receive faxes. She doesn't talk over the phone. And she doesn't read the emails. So, well, I insisted, being a journalist, you have to insist. And finally, this person, I think she felt sorry for me a little bit and said, well, the only thing I can give you is her agent's email or phone number. And I said, well, great, give me her agent's. So I called the agent. And the agent again said, well, she's not keen of interviews, but you may try. You should send me a fax saying why do you want to interview her, which books of her have you read, which subjects in her writing you would like to talk about. She gave me like 8 questions, which were impossible to answer in just one page, of course. But I did my best. I said that only that one page. So she said, well, after you send the fax, don't call me again, please. If she says yes, I will let you know, and if not, just forget about it. So, I don't know, 2 weeks after, I got an email saying that Joyce Carol Oates had agreed. So we arranged an interview, and the agent gave me a very secret phone number of Joyce Carol Oates, where I should call her when I arrived in New York.
Okay, yeah.
And arrange to go to Princeton. So I did that. When I arrived in New York, I phoned Joyce Carol Oates, and she answered. And she said like, oh, Paula, yes. And she was like an aunt, almost. A lovely aunt. So I went to Princeton, and I did that first, interview to a very, very well-known, worldwide known writer.
And do you have the feeling when you're doing literary interviews that you're entering inside the border of their minds?
Oh, yes.
Yeah?
Oh, yes.
And how do you go about it?
Well, the way I learned to do it, I learned tricks, on the way doing this. What I learned with that first big interview, I should say, with Joyce Carol Oates, is that, the writers who agreed, you never know why they agreed, because I was going to write articles in Argentina, and for them, Argentina is a non-existent market, so it's not like being interviewed, from the New York Times, the Guardian. But she asked me questions. Supposedly, as an interviewer, you shouldn't answer questions because you are doing the interview. But at that moment, I realized that I was going to break that rule, and I was going to answer. And she was curious about Buenos Aires. Of course, she had never been there, never been in South America, but she was curious. She told me she had a friend in New York who was also Argentine and around my age. So, I told her about Argentina, and that way, that became a conversation, and she kind of forgot that we were in an interview. Yeah. So it became a conversation. And then there was another interesting subject because she's so interested in boxing. And she wrote a book that's called On Boxing.
Yes, of course.
So when we were talking about boxing, I told her the story of an Argentine boxer who had killed his wife, actually. And he had gone to jail. And in Argentina, every person that's sent to jail, they have all these lawyers, and they end up being 1 year instead of 10. But this man didn't want to do that. He wanted to stay in jail all the years they had sentenced him to. So, well, I told her that story, and well, that, you know, the wall between us was being torn down, and she felt she could ask also, that she wasn't there just to be asked, but that we could talk, that I was also a human being that could be asked, that was not going to refuse to be asked, that I was flexible, you know. So I found that that flexibility is very important, because if you don't do that, it's like it gets tight at certain moments.
Yes. And flexibility is a key word for you, in as much as you are both a fiction and a non-fiction writer. If we could turn towards your fiction, your novels and your short stories, how do you go about creating a world of fiction? And when do you enter in, when do you pass the threshold into the world of fiction to create your work?
Well, my two novels, one has some parts are autobiographical, but but still, what I learned is that if you have some autobiographical elements, you're working on a text. I mean, your life is not interesting for the readers at all, so you have to build a text. So, well, I feel the need to go into that world of fiction and to get away, say from, you know, reality as it is. So it's really a need that I felt since I was a child. And I started, like, I remember when I was in first and second grade, I got a little bit bored at school, because I was like a great student, because I loved learning. So I started writing short stories on things that I was told at school, and on other things. So stories of adventure. I liked adventure a lot. You know, of kids who went fishing and they suddenly caught a whale, for example. And well, I liked that world. I needed that world of what's fiction, you know. So, and it's always a world of fiction, even when you write. I realized that with some autobiographical moments. My second novel has none at all. It's all invention. And, well, it came from voices, because that novel has a lot of dialogue. And I like I like listening to dialogues. So that novel came a lot from the need of writing dialogues. And then I built a narrator to go, you know, in the gaps of the dialogues.
And we like listening to you. Thank you very much for this conversation, Paula Varsavsky. And we know that we are looking forward to reading both your fiction and your non-fiction, and to see what a professional writer has done with other professional writers. Thank you very much.
Thanks to you.